Good day and welcome to my channel. In this lesson, we will discuss Flutter Widget Life Cycle. By life cycle, I mean a series of methods that occur during the lifespan of a widget. The first method that we will discuss today is the creation method. Some call it constructor. Now, I have created some series of files here, 2 or 3 files here that we will use to explain all these methods. And so the first one, as I said, creation or constructor, what it means is that when you create a new instance of this counter widget, the constructor of this widget gets invoked. And so if I go through the entry point of Flutter, which is the main method, I am creating a new instance of the counter widget here, over here. It means that the constructor of the counter widget will be invoked if I should run the app or I should build the app. The next one is the initialization. Some call it init-state, the same thing. Now, after you have called or invoked this constructor, the init-state of that widget also gets invoked. Often than not, this is where you perform your network request. This is where you open files and the likes, because it is a one-time initialization. Okay, and so it means that as I have created an instance of this, the counter widget over here, its constructor gets invoked, and then the init method also gets invoked. Okay, so the next method is the build method or the building method. If you look at the counter widget as I have here, I have my build method here. Now, the build method is responsible for creating the element that composes one's widget user interface. How your interface will look like. That is the responsibility of the build method. If you look at what I have here, I have an app bar, of course, scaffold, app bar. I have this column, and then the column composes of the test widget, the button, and then the FAB. Okay, all under the umbrella of the scaffold. And so that is what the build or the building method does. Next, we have the rebuilding or the update widget method. If the widget, now what this means is that if the widget receives new data or if its parent gets rebuilt, this method gets called. This is where normally you handle changes in the widget configuration, and then also this is where you update the internal state of the widget accordingly. The next one we have is the set state, which we use often. Now, what happens is that whenever you want to trigger a rebuild of the widget, let's say if I want to trigger a rebuild of this counter widget, the set state, as I have defined it over here, gets invoked or gets called. When you invoke or you call the set state, it notifies Flutter to rebuild the widget and any dependent of that widget. All the dependents of that widget also get updated. That is what the set state does. And then we have the last one, which I call the distraction. Some call it the activation. In fact, I've broken it down into pieces. The activation, and then removal and cleanup. Okay, what happened here is that when a widget with respect to the deactivation, when a widget is removed from the widget tree, or when you navigate from one screen to another, as I have done here, using this test button, if I should navigate from one screen to another, this method gets called. This is the perfect place for you to clean up some of the resources you are using in the project. And then you have the remover. What the remover does is that when the widget you are using, for instance, if this widget is no longer in use or is no longer needed, to be removed from the widget tree, the dispose method or the remover method does this. Okay, now enough with the theory. Let's go through the code I have written here. Because of that, let me get rid of this. Like I said, I am calling a new instance of this, the counter widget, and so the constructor gets invoked, and then the init state gets invoked. If you look at the code here, I have a variable as my initial state, which is the counter, and I'm using it here, representing the counter in the UI over here. Okay, now what is happening here is that Whenever I initialize or I restart the app or I build the app, this will be invoked. The init state will be invoked. So let me show you, probably go through the console. I've already built the app here, as you can see. And so we can restart it again for you to have a look at it. When I restart the app, the init state over here gets called, as you can see in the console. Why? Because I am calling this widget in the entry point or the main function, which in turn calls the constructor, which in turn calls the init state. You understand me? Now the next method that gets called is the build method. Why? Because we need it to build the UI, how we want the UI to look. And so it also gets called. Okay, now when I click on the FAB, the floating action button, what I do is that I invoke the set state, which will subsequently update the UI. It will notify Flutter to rebuild the UI and any dependent that is relying on this counter widget. And so when I call the set state, as I will show you, I have to get this to updating the UI, and then also the did update will also get invoked. And so I have it here. When I click on this, you can check the console. The set state it has been invoked. The did update has also been invoked. And then Flutter notifies the UI that, hey, there has been changes. So rebuild the UI for me. Now let's go on. Now we have other methods here, which is the distraction method, the deactivate, and then the dispose method. You will best see these things when I move to the other file I have created. That's fetching data. And so we have this also to help us explain the Flutter lifecycle widgets. I have this widget, I call this data fetching widget, and then I have this empty list here after I'm performing a network request over here in the init state. When I invoke this widget, I want this method to be called. It's an asynchronous function. I'm fetching data from this endpoint, and then I'll display them. In fact, I'll push that data in this empty list, and then I'll display it in the UI. Okay, so this is it. When I navigate, I'm going to navigate from this screen to where I'm fetching the data. And so I'm fetching the data. Okay, so that is it. The data has been fetched. If an error occurred, I'm sure I was also handling that. I'm handling that over here. Okay, now the data has been fetched. And so when the data is fetched, what happens? The set state gets called to rebuild the UI with the data that I have received from the endpoint over here. And so I'm using the build method over here to compose or to demonstrate how my UI should look like. I want mine to look this way. And the build method is helping me to do that. You understand? Okay. Now, when I decide to move away from this screen over here, and probably go back, the distraction method will be called. Remember, the distraction method is composed of the deactivate and then the dispose. And so when I go back, you can check the console. When I click the back button, what happens? First and foremost, the deactivate method gets called because the screen that I was is no longer needed. I have pushed myself from one screen to the previous screen. And then the dispose method also gets invoked. Now, understanding and managing a widget lifecycle is very important. If you're able to properly handle each of the stages that you've gone through, you'll be able to have a very performant app, and also you'll be able to ensure that the resources being used in the app are managed efficiently. And that brings us to the end of this lesson. Please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more videos. Thanks for watching.